In the middle of vacation, my son wrote to me, "We know this is your apartment by the sea, but we want to be alone with my wife's parents, so move to a hotel." I replied, "Got it," and then I made my final move. What happened an hour later made the in-laws beg my son to divorce their daughter. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. I'm Betty, 70 years old, and I like to think I've earned the right to a little luxury, a little mischief, and certainly a lot of peace. My seaside apartment, perched above the restless waves like some stubborn sentinel, is my sanctuary. The salty tang of the ocean drifts through the open balcony doors, mixing with the faint aroma of the coffee I brewed myself. A ritual I guard fiercely, for mornings are sacred and not to be rushed by the world. I sit in my favorite armchair, a faded wingback that has somehow molded perfectly to my shape over decades, cradling a mug with a hand that has known both the tenderness of a child and the stubbornness of old age. The first sip of coffee hits, warm and sharp, and I close my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet hum of the sea sink into my bones. The horizon stretches endless and blue, indifferent to all human scheming, and for a heartbeat, I feel utterly untouchable, the master of my own little universe. Then, as if on cue to remind me that solitude is always precarious, my phone buzzes. The sharp vibration shatters the gentle rhythm of the morning, and I pick it up with a practiced sigh. It's David, my son, and I already know that particular combination of emojis and clipped phrasing. He always writes as though he's arranging a board meeting rather than speaking to his mother. The message is brief, clinical, and entirely familiar in its tone. "We know this is your apartment by the sea, but we want to be alone with my wife's parents, so move to a hotel." I blink at the screen and, against my better judgment, let out a laugh. David, always the manager, the orchestrator of family logistics, never seems to notice that life is made more interesting when a little chaos is allowed to seep in. He assumes control, coordinates, directs, and nudges, never fully appreciating that some of us, me for instance, have a certain flair for the unexpected. I set the phone down for a moment, letting the words settle, and I watch a gull wheel low over the water. Its wings cut the air with effortless precision, unbothered by anything, and I think, not for the first time, that I envy birds. They don't text their mothers about logistics or expect obedience. They just glide, light and free. A pang of amusement dances through me. If only David knew the lengths I could go when left to my own devices. I reply with deliberate simplicity, "Got it." No punctuation for extra weight, no exclamation point to betray the faint thrill of mischief bubbling under my skin. Just those two words, cool and unassuming, yet loaded with potential. My fingers linger over the keyboard, savoring the moment, because in this tiny exchange lies the opening move in a game that, for decades, David has assumed he controls. Little does he suspect that the quiet mother he thought easily guided is about to become the orchestrator herself. I take another sip of coffee, slower this time, letting it burn the tip of my tongue, sharp and grounding. I imagine David bustling around my apartment, deciding how to rearrange furniture, clearing countertops of my carefully curated trinkets, perhaps even straightening pictures on the walls as though aesthetic approval belongs to him. He has a tendency to forget that this apartment, perched above the sea, has been built with memory and intention. Each seashell on the balcony railing, each framed photograph of my life, each stack of books carefully chosen for both wisdom and whimsy, It all carries the subtle weight of decades of choices. And he, poor naive boy, assumes it's all just waiting for his permission. A part of me relishes this, the quiet thrill that comes with being underestimated. At 70, I have learned that people often forget the cunning tucked beneath the surface of age. They assume experience dulls a person, when in truth it sharpens them. I feel that sharpness now, humming through my veins as clearly as the salt air. I set the mug down on the table beside me and leaned back in the chair, letting my gaze drift over the room. Sunlight spills across the polished wood floor, highlighting tiny motes of dust that dance lazily in the air. Everything appears serene, ordered, and perfect in its own small way. And yet, within that serenity lies opportunity. Within that perfection lies the possibility of a move that will unravel assumptions, that will disturb the careful plans of others without even touching their daily comfort, an invisible hand guiding events, quietly, deliberately. For a long moment, I simply sit, watching the waves rise and fall, letting the sound of the ocean mingle with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I feel a curious satisfaction, a kind of private glee reserved for those who know they are about to turn the tables, who understand the sweet justice of an unanticipated counterplay. David may think he's orchestrating, but I am already thinking 3 steps ahead, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. By the time I rise to gather my suitcase and check into a nearby hotel, the plan is already in motion, fully formed in my mind. I will move quietly, unassumingly, but every gesture, every glance, every choice will set the stage for what is to come. They have no idea. Not yet, and that, my dear heart, is where the real delight begins. I checked into a quaint hotel just a block away, a building that looked as though it had been plucked from a bygone era and preserved with stubborn care, the kind of place where the smell of polished wood and old carpets clung to the air like a memory. The desk clerk, a young man with a perpetual look of mild suspicion, handed me my key, and I allowed myself a slow, exaggerated sigh as I carried the suitcase to the room. A faint pout tugged at my lips, not for real sulking, of course, but enough to give the impression of mild inconvenience, the kind that might nudge my son into thinking he had finally asserted control over his mother. From my window, I could see my apartment building, the small balcony jutting into the salty breeze, my open doors now serving as the entryway for David, Karen, and most importantly, her parents. They had arrived like a well-rehearsed parade. Karen clung politely to her mother Eleanor, while Mr. Simmons, a man whose composure seemed carved from marble, inspected the apartment as if it were a museum exhibit, rather than someone else's home. David, my boy, looked pleased with himself, striding about with the confidence of a general inspecting his troops. I allowed a thin smile to spread across my face. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, began to prick at me. The Simmonses had always projected an image of flawlessness. Perfect manners, flawless attire, laughter that sounded spontaneous, but was meticulously timed, gestures polished to the point of artifice. But I had known them long enough to see through the sheen, and I had a memory that could rival an archive. Years of small interactions, overheard confessions, and subtle slips, all catalogued meticulously in the quiet corners of my mind, gave me insight that they would never suspect I possessed. I could almost see the cracks in their composed facade if I looked closely, and I intended to look closely. I poured a cup of tea in my hotel room, the familiar ritual grounding me, and settled near the window with my notebook, a pen poised. There was no overt plan yet, merely observation, but even observation is power when wielded correctly. I watched as Eleanor hovered around the kitchen, her movements precise, almost ritualistic, as if arranging the fruit bowl or adjusting the curtains might somehow prove her superiority. Mr. Simmons, who prided himself on a calm and unflappable exterior, examined the bookshelves, tapping lightly on the spines, an almost imperceptible frown tugging at his mouth. Karen laughed at some imagined joke of David's, a laughter that seemed rehearsed for effect, and I caught myself noting the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hand lingered on her mother's arm. It was all too predictable and yet fascinating. I had never considered myself a voyeur, but the satisfaction of watching these people slip into someone else's space, believing themselves in command, was difficult to resist. Their smiles were slightly too bright, their voices too measured, their confidence slightly exaggerated, as though they were all simultaneously performing for each other and for some unseen audience. And I, uninvited, became the silent judge, cataloging every micro-expression, every tick, every tiny betrayal of truth beneath the polished exterior. Curiosity deepened into an almost magnetic pull. I remembered a conversation from years ago when Eleanor had confessed to me, over tea, in a rare moment of honesty, that she sometimes envied families who operated without constant calculation. "We keep everything in order," she had said, stirring her cup, "because chaos terrifies us." Her voice had been careful, guarded, yet there had been a tremor of vulnerability that only a mother or someone who had lived long enough to see patterns could detect. I recalled that tremor now, and I wondered whether she remembered the moment at all. Would she recognize that I had not forgotten? I leaned back in the hotel chair, taking a slow sip of tea, and allowed myself a tiny smirk. Curiosity is a dangerous companion when paired with knowledge. I had the knowledge. They had the confidence. The combination promised a spectacle, though of course, from my perspective, it would be subtle. One does not need to shout to unsettle those who rely entirely on appearances. Small gestures, carefully observed, are often more effective than grand proclamations. I began to imagine all the things I had noticed in their past visits. The subtle competitiveness between Eleanor and Karen, the faint superiority Harold assumed in every discussion, the small, careless comments that betrayed a sense of entitlement. None of it was overt, nothing that could be pinned in a courtroom of public opinion, but in private, under scrutiny, it all formed a tapestry, one I now held in my mind, thread by thread. For the first time in decades, I felt a certain thrill. Not the reckless thrill of youth, nor the frantic energy of midlife rebellion, but the measured, deliberate excitement of a mind in full command of its tools. I could see the possibilities unfolding like the tide against the shore, gradual, inevitable, unstoppable. The apartment, once a mere retreat for my own comfort, had become a stage, and I was the quiet observer, the silent puppeteer. Curiosity danced in my mind, teasing me with what I might discover, testing my patience, urging me to wait for the right moment, to let observation mature into action, subtle but precise. And so I waited, sipping my tea, watching them move through my carefully arranged apartment, noting every nuance, every imperfection in their perfection, letting curiosity sharpen my senses. For the first time, I felt truly engaged in the game, knowing I was not merely a player displaced from my home, but a strategist, seeing all the angles, anticipating all the moves. Curiosity, after all, is the precursor to understanding, and understanding is power. I watched discreetly from my perch by the hotel window, the steaming cup of tea warming my hands as I allowed my gaze to roam over my apartment a block away. It was strange, almost exhilarating, to observe the people I knew so well inhabiting my space as if it were theirs, convinced of their control, oblivious to the fact that I was scrutinizing every movement, every slip, every subtle betrayal of character. I sipped my tea slowly, deliberately, the bitter tang sharpening my focus as I catalogued the scene below like a meticulous curator of human behavior. Within minutes, the cracks began to appear. Eleanor, polished to a fault, leaned slightly toward Karen, whispering sharply about David, my boy, being useless with finances. Her voice was soft, almost conspiratorial, but sharp enough that the edge of judgment sliced cleanly through the air. I felt a flicker of amusement, quickly tempered by something darker, a twinge of disgust. Here they were, the picture-perfect family facade, the smiles so rehearsed they could have been carved in wax, and yet, underneath, the judgment flowed freely, unchecked and venomous. Mr. Simmons, too, betrayed himself in subtle ways. Leaning over the countertop, he examined the fruit salad Karen had prepared for lunch, the expression on his face almost imperceptibly disdainful. He muttered something under his breath, something critical of his own daughter's culinary attempt, and I caught it, crisp as the light glinting off a spoon. Polished people indeed. So fast to evaluate, so eager to assert superiority, yet so fragile when reality intruded even in the smallest form. Their fragility was deliciously transparent, and yet it stirred a kind of righteous disgust in me. How often had I seen people like this, carefully curated, meticulously constructed, and so thoroughly dependent on appearances, tear themselves apart over the smallest imperfections. I found myself leaning back slightly, the chair creaking under my weight, and considered the irony. This was the very essence of their lives, controlling and directing, manipulating appearances, weaving a net of social perfection, and yet crumbling under a whisper of imperfection. Their confidence, so carefully maintained, dissolved in a moment when faced with something as simple as a mildly uneven fruit salad or a tiny oversight in finances. And here I was, removed from the scene, a silent observer wielding insight and memory like a scalpel, dissecting behavior that most people would happily ignore. My disgust deepened as I noted Eleanor's gestures, her hands fluttering nervously over the tablecloth as she spoke, her eyes darting to her husband for affirmation even while she passed judgment on David. She relied on the performance, the reinforcement of authority through whisper and glance, and yet it was hollow and fragile, a paper-thin layer of composure stretched over insecurity. The contrast was almost grotesque in its clarity, the effort to appear superior, juxtaposed against the inevitability of human weakness. And Mr. Simmons, equally meticulous in his projection of calm, was subtly undermining the very family cohesion he pretended to hold dear. Every glance, every word, every carefully measured nod was an unintentional betrayal of the perfect image they wanted me to see. I let my eyes linger on Karen for a moment. She laughed at David's jokes, though faintly, the laughter forced, hesitant, as though testing the environment for approval rather than expressing genuine amusement. Her shoulder brushed her mother's in a subtle, almost pleading way, an unconscious attempt at reassurance. It was clear to me now, curiosity and observation revealing what propriety concealed, that the family unit I had admired at a distance was far more fragile than it seemed. Polished people, finely tuned instruments of propriety, yet so easily frayed at the edges, unraveling when placed under the smallest pressure. I felt the slow heat of determination rise within me, mixing with the disgust. Observation alone was not enough. Insight required action. The lesson would have to be precise, delicate, almost surgical. Not a confrontation, God forbid, but a demonstration of consequences subtle enough that their own minds would betray them before I ever spoke. The idea alone brought a suppressed thrill, a satisfaction that was both indulgent and righteous. To let them see themselves as they truly were, to expose the cracks beneath their facade, without ever touching them directly. This was the kind of cunning that age affords, the patience that 70 years can cultivate. I sipped my tea again, letting the steam curl around my face, and felt the thrill sharpen into clarity. There would be no need for drama, no need for overt conflict. Polished people like this cannot tolerate the appearance of disorder. They recoil, they scramble. They betray themselves in a dozen small ways before they ever realize they are trapped. And I, seated a mere block away, was the unseen catalyst. I allowed my gaze to linger, my mind mapping every subtle interaction, every flicker of discomfort, and considered how best to apply the insight. Timing would be everything. Subtlety would be my greatest weapon. I felt disgust, yes, but also a gleeful anticipation. There was power in observation, in memory, in the quiet knowledge of human fragility. And as the afternoon sun slanted across the balcony of my apartment, illuminating the very space where they believed themselves in command, I realized something profound. They had no idea who was truly watching, who truly understood, and who would eventually make them confront the truth of themselves. That, I decided, would be the most satisfying part of all. I let my tea cool, swirling the liquid absent-mindedly as I picked up my phone. A simple, casual message was all it took. "Mom's just around. Hope you're behaving with your in-laws." I pressed send, knowing full well the effect it would have. David, ever confident, would laugh, shrug, and tell himself it was just a teasing remark. That was the beauty of it. The pretense of casualness was the perfect cover for what I intended. I leaned back in my chair, watching the afternoon light shift across the hotel room, imagining the scene unfolding in my apartment. Karen, Eleanor, and Harold were likely mid-laugh over some small joke David had made, assuming they had everything under control. Their relaxation was exactly what I needed. Confidence, after all, is the easiest thing to dismantle when it has no true foundation. I took a slow sip of tea and let my mind trace back the years of meticulous record-keeping I had maintained in that apartment. The apartment's secret guest book, as I had begun thinking of it lately, wasn't a formal diary. Oh no, it was something far more valuable. Every whispered complaint, every vulnerable confession, every tiny boast that was meant to impress me or charm me, all cataloged carefully in the margins of my memory and now recorded in black ink on creamy pages. A ledger of human foibles, small humiliations, and long-forgotten truths. It had begun as a personal curiosity, a mental exercise, but over decades it had grown into a carefully curated archive that was simultaneously private, harmless, and dangerous in the right hands. And today, those hands were mine. I allowed myself a thin smile. I knew instinctively that mentioning it would rattle them, but not in the obvious way. Not yet. They would not see the trap until they were already ensnared, caught between curiosity, fear, and their own pride. Polished people, as I had discovered repeatedly, are fragile in precisely the areas they most want to believe secure. Secrets are like loose threads in a tapestry. They look innocuous until pulled, and then the whole picture starts to unravel. I typed another note into my phone, a small breadcrumb, and imagined how it would read when it arrived. By the way, the apartment's guest book has some entries you might find enlightening. I pictured Eleanor's reaction first. Her eyebrows would arch just slightly, a micro-expression that would betray suspicion before her words could even form. Her voice, usually so careful and measured, would likely falter when she questioned David about it. And Harold, with his unflappable exterior, would be forced to shift, adjust, straighten himself, betraying nerves in subtle, unintentional ways. I imagined them leaning toward one another, whispering urgently, scanning the apartment for this mysterious guest book, each glance a tiny admission of doubt. They would begin to question what was remembered, what had been recorded, and whether their carefully polished images had survived the scrutiny of someone who knew them intimately. And I, a block away, would be the silent conductor, orchestrating the rising tension with nothing more than a suggestion and the weight of decades of observation. I allowed my mind to linger on the delicacy of the moment. Timing was everything. Drop too many hints, and they would dismiss it as exaggeration. Too few, and they might remain comfortably ignorant. The balance had to be perfect, subtle enough that curiosity would outweigh skepticism. That pride would compel investigation, that fear, just the smallest, most manageable fear, would push them toward the trap I had set. I leaned closer to the window, watching the shadows shift along the balcony of my apartment. I could almost see Eleanor pausing mid-step, her hand hesitating over the coffee mug as she processed the possibility. Harold would clear his throat, stiffen his shoulders, trying to maintain composure, but the slightest tremor in his voice would betray the unease I had long suspected lay beneath his smooth exterior. And David, my sweet, overly confident boy, would try to reassure them, to laugh it off, yet the very act of defending himself would signal that they were onto something. The thrill of anticipation tightened my chest, a quiet, controlled excitement. I was not just observing, I was sculpting the environment, setting into motion a chain of subtle psychological reactions, the likes of which I had spent years perfecting in private practice and personal amusement. Every word, every glance, every hesitation was a piece of a puzzle they did not know they were completing for me. I set my teacup down, letting my fingers hover over the rim as I exhaled slowly. The stage was prepared. The trap was set. I would not rush. I would let the tension build naturally, allow their own curiosity, pride, and fear to do the work for me. And when the moment came, it would be exquisite, precise, deliberate, and irreversible. Sitting back, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Polished people, I thought, are easiest to unravel when they believe themselves untouchable. And today, they were walking straight into the web I had spent decades refining, unaware that the observer had become the architect. I returned to my hotel room that morning with a calm, deliberate air, carrying only a light tote of personal items and, of course, the guest book. It was a modest leather-bound volume, unassuming from the outside, yet heavy with decades of observation, minor confessions, and private musings that I had recorded with the meticulous patience of someone who knew human nature better than most. I placed it on the dining table in the apartment with what I practiced to appear a purely accidental casualness, carelessly near the center, spine facing up, as though left in haste while fetching something else. The timing was deliberate. I could imagine them laughing moments before, utterly confident in the perfection of their environment, in the harmony of appearances. Polished families like the Simmonses are convinced that their reputations shield them from scrutiny. Curiosity, though, is a far stronger impulse than caution, and I trusted that instinct to do the work I had long planned. It did not take long. Eleanor, her eyes catching the edge of the leather spine, paused mid-step, and I could almost hear the subtle shift in her posture, the imperceptible stiffening of her fingers as they hovered over the book. The illusion of casualness gave way to curiosity, sharp and insistent. Harold's eyes narrowed, calculating, as if evaluating whether picking it up would be considered intrusive or forbidden. And Karen, oblivious to the tension building like a storm cloud above them, merely smiled, assuming it was an innocuous scrapbook, one of my quaint ways of preserving memories. And then it began. Eleanor, despite the shadow of suspicion lingering at the corners of her eyes, opened the book. The initial rustle of pages was quiet, polite, almost reverent, and I could feel it through the subtle vibration of the phone I had placed nearby to check the timing of my own return. The first entry revealed a detail she had long forgotten, or perhaps thought I had forgotten. A confession of hers from decades earlier, admitting she had hidden money meant for charity to cover some personal expense. Innocent enough on paper, but scandalous when read aloud in the wrong company. I imagined her finger tracing the words, the slow realization settling into the lines of her face, and the subtle exchange of glances between her and Harold, searching for reassurance, for any sign that the text could be dismissed as irrelevant or fabricated. But the truth, even softened by memory, is rarely so easily shrugged off. Turning the page, Harold encountered an entry even more damning to the careful veneer he had cultivated. Years ago, he had been involved in an office incident, a minor financial discrepancy, swiftly covered up but recorded in my ledger with painstaking accuracy. The phrasing was neutral, almost clinical, yet when read aloud, it carried the full weight of impropriety. I imagined his throat tightening, the slight flush creeping across his cheeks, the familiar mask of composure beginning to warp as the words settled into undeniable reality. Karen's eyes widened slightly, curiosity now overtaking amusement, and I could see her subtly leaning forward, drawn in by the magnetic pull of revelation. Their carefully constructed identities, polished and rehearsed for decades, were fracturing under the soft, insistent force of memory made tangible. Each word, each line, each confession was a mirror held up to their faces, revealing inconsistencies they had long hoped remained hidden. I allowed myself a quiet, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that comes from witnessing the first stirrings of justice in motion. The entries I had chosen to include were deliberate, calculated to reveal the vulnerabilities beneath their civility. I did not rush them. The process of shock is far more satisfying when gradual. There was a delicate tension in the room, a quiet electricity as Eleanor and Harold absorbed, processed, and muttered over the revelations, their voices taut with disbelief. The sophistication of their usual deflections, the practiced laughter, the polite interjections, the subtle gaslighting of one another began to falter under the weight of concrete, written evidence. They shifted uneasily in their seats, glanced at each other with unguarded suspicion, and for the first time, the armor of control slipped. Their polished facade, so carefully maintained, was visibly crumbling, page by page. Even as I remained in the hotel, I could picture the small, seemingly insignificant details of their behavior. Eleanor's hand gripping the book too tightly, Harold's foot tapping a nervous rhythm against the floor, Karen leaning closer, sensing both the intrigue and the tension, yet unsure how to intervene. The shock was a living thing in the room, breathing and expanding with each entry, quietly amplifying the dissonance between their self-image and reality. And all of it had been set into motion with a simple, deliberate act, leaving a book in plain sight, just enough to tempt their curiosity, but not force it. It was a trap woven with years of observation, a demonstration of cause and effect that they could neither ignore nor dismiss. The elegance of it was almost intoxicating. I sipped my tea again, letting the warmth fill me, and imagined the cascade of reactions yet to unfold. The first wave of shock had begun, and there was no turning back. The polished veneer of control, pride, and propriety was cracking, and I, the quiet observer, was both witness and architect of the inevitable unraveling. By the time the hour had slipped by, the atmosphere in the apartment had transformed completely. What had begun as casual laughter and light teasing had curdled into a quiet frenzy of tension. Through the window of my hotel room, I could see them in vivid clarity, every gesture, every glance, every micro-expression magnified by the careful distance I maintained. Eleanor was gripping her pearls with trembling hands, the once composed woman reduced to an anxious, wringing mess. Her carefully coiffed hair seemed suddenly incongruous with the raw panic flickering across her face. Harold, the ever-reserved man who prided himself on reason and composure, was pacing in slow, deliberate arcs, his polished demeanor cracked by the rapid thumping of his thoughts. David, bless him, was in the eye of the storm, utterly unprepared. He stood frozen, eyebrows drawn together, trying to process the sight of his normally composed in-laws leaning in toward him with uncharacteristic urgency. Their voices were hushed, but carried a sharp intensity that cut through the air like a blade. "Divorce her," Eleanor whispered, voice taut with fear, almost pleading. "Please, this marriage, this family, we can't." I leaned back in my chair in the hotel, letting the words resonate in my mind like a symphony of long overdue justice. The subtlety of the moment was exquisite. My son's bewilderment was the perfect counterpoint to their hysteria, and I could see his mind racing, struggling to reconcile the calm, composed mother-in-law he knew with the desperate, gasping figures now confronting him. Their whispers were punctuated by quick, almost imperceptible glances at one another, a silent negotiation of disbelief. Each page they had read in the guest book had systematically eroded their sense of control, replacing it with a frantic need to prevent further exposure. I could see Harold's jaw tighten as he tried to formulate a rational plan, any plan, that might restore some measure of dignity to the situation. But rationality has little purchase when reality is written in ink and proof lies in plain sight, each line a mirror reflecting decades of moral compromise and self-serving manipulation. The beauty of it, I thought, was in the timing. They had been lulled into a false sense of security by the casualness of my departure, the idea that I was away while they occupied my apartment. The initial confidence had been their undoing. By the time they realized the depth of what they had exposed, their fear had metastasized into desperation. The dynamic had shifted so completely that even the smallest gestures, the furrow of a brow, the tight press of a hand against the table, spoke volumes. David, standing at the epicenter of their panic, tried to respond, to reassure, to reason. His words were cautious, tentative, his usual certainty replaced by a growing unease. "Mom left the guest book?" "Really?" he murmured, eyes darting between them. But Eleanor's clutch on his sleeve was firm, insistent, and Harold's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, an anchor of urgency. "It's not just about the book, David," Eleanor whispered. "It's about everything we trusted, everything we believed. You don't understand." The desperation was infectious. Even Karen, who had initially laughed at the idea of her parents being flustered, now watched with wide eyes, her own smile evaporating under the heat of sudden revelation. The carefully curated harmony of appearances, the smiles, the laughter, the rehearsed civility, had collapsed into a tableau of raw, unfiltered panic. Each of them was a live wire, reacting instinctively to a reality that had been meticulously revealed, piece by piece, by someone who had observed them for decades. I sipped my tea slowly, luxuriating in the subtle art of influence. I had done nothing overt. I had not confronted, not accused, not admonished. I had merely left a book, a physical artifact of memory, and allowed it to speak for itself. The result was more powerful than any direct confrontation could ever have been. In less than 60 minutes, I had taken years of polished deceit, pride, and self-righteous judgment and laid them bare. I imagined their whispers, muttering over each new revelation, each small confession, words meant to be private, now amplified by the weight of their own shock. The elegant facades they had maintained for so long were slipping like sand through fingers, leaving only the raw, exposed core of who they truly were. And David, bewildered and caught in the crossfire, had become the unwitting witness to the collapse of authority and image. I let a quiet smile settle over my face. This was not malice. It was justice, elegantly executed. Their desperation, their frantic pleas, were the natural consequence of the choices they had made over decades, their insistence on appearances over integrity, their judgments over empathy. I had merely provided the lens through which reality could finally be seen. As the hour ended, the intensity in the apartment reached its peak. I set down my cup and leaned back, watching the scene in silent satisfaction. The architecture of deception, long hidden, had been dismantled with precision. The scene was chaotic, raw, and unavoidable, and I, observer and orchestrator, could finally savor the completeness of the tableau I had created. I returned to my hotel room with a deliberate calm, as if I were stepping out of a storm I had carefully orchestrated. The sea breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of salt and pine, the kind of air that reminds you that life is larger than any petty domestic skirmish. I poured myself a cup of tea, feeling the warmth seep through my hands, grounding me in the simple reality of the present. The steam curled up like a ghost of past frustrations, and I allowed myself a small, private smile. Victory has a quiet flavor, far sweeter than the noise of argument or confrontation. At 70, I have learned the power of patience and observation, the value of letting things unfold on their own terms. Today was a testament to both. I had watched the carefully constructed veneer of the Simmonses, polished over decades, crack under the weight of their own secrets, and I had done it without raising my voice, without accusing, without forcing anyone into a corner. It had been a ballet of subtle nudges, strategic placements, and long-held knowledge. I felt light, almost buoyant, as if the years of careful study of human behavior had culminated in this singular, elegant moment of truth. My mind wandered back over the hour that had passed in the apartment, the tension thick enough to taste. I could see Eleanor's hand shaking as she clutched her pearls, the rhythmic tapping of Harold's shoes on the floor echoing his panic. David had been a deer caught in headlights, unsure where to look, how to respond, or even what to think. And Karen, oh Karen, whose laughter had been so bright at the outset, now muted, overshadowed by the weight of parental terror. It had been exquisite, in the most cathartic sense, to witness the perfect masks of propriety dissolve into raw, exposed vulnerability. I had not needed to speak. My mere presence, the carefully forgotten ledger, and the patient passing of time had been enough to unravel them. They had sought control over my son, over his household, over the narrative of family life. They had believed their curated perfection could dominate, intimidate, and dictate. They had underestimated me. I had given them reality. The ledger had done what no lecture, no confrontation, no sharp word could have accomplished. It had reflected back their own misdeeds and insecurities with unflinching clarity. Each entry, each tiny confession, was a mirror held up to their faces. The reflection had been unbearable, yet entirely fair. I sipped my tea slowly, enjoying the gentle bite of Earl Grey on my tongue. The sun had begun its descent, painting the horizon in hues of gold and rose, a reminder that life moves forward, that every day ends and begins again. I felt a rare amusement at the absurdity of human pretense, the way pride and self-importance can twist people into caricatures of themselves. Eleanor and Harold had been meticulous in their public image, but the ledger revealed them as they truly were, judgmental, controlling, and yet desperately fragile when faced with the consequences of their own behavior. I allowed myself a quiet chuckle at the thought of my son's bewilderment. David had always assumed that his mother's interference was mild, that I would always play the harmless observer, the indulgent parent. Today had proven otherwise. Today had been a lesson in subtlety, in the power of patience, and in the art of quiet cunning. I had reminded him, without a word of reproach, that sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who watch and wait, hold the sharpest edge. There was a satisfying irony in the fact that the in-laws, who had prided themselves on moral superiority and social poise, were now reduced to pleading, to begging, to a desperate scramble to restore a dignity that no longer existed. Their perfect little world had collapsed under the weight of truth, and they had no one to blame but themselves. The ledger had been impartial, relentless, and beautifully precise. I could almost hear the echo of their frantic whispers, their rapid-fire rationalizations, their futile attempts to impose reason on the chaos they had themselves created. I looked out over the water, watching the sun slip slowly beneath the horizon, a final blaze of triumph lighting the sky. I felt light, victorious, and, in a way, rejuvenated. There is a profound satisfaction in seeing justice, subtle but absolute, delivered without violence or anger, just observation, patience, and strategy. I had orchestrated it perfectly, and the outcome had been even more cathartic than I could have imagined. I raised my cup to the horizon, a silent toast to the quiet power of experience and patience. They had wanted control, influence, a narrative tailored to their image. I had given them reality. And oh, did they beg for mercy. In that moment, I realized that life, at its core, rewards those who watch, those who wait, those who understand that power often lies not in the loudest voice, but in the sharpest mind. The tea was gone, the sun had disappeared, and I felt a rare, full-bodied sense of peace. The world, in all its chaos and pretense, had bent just enough to accommodate my final, subtle triumph. I settled back in my chair, letting the quiet wash over me, the soft crash of waves below a fitting accompaniment to the serene satisfaction that comes from a perfectly executed plan.